I first became involved with the World Policy Institute when it was acquired by the New School in 1991. And James Chase, who was the editor of World Policy Journal at that time, I remember he came to my apartment and he said, "Make me famous," because I was sort of brought in a public relations capacity at the very early phase. And I wasn't really interested in making James Chase famous. He was famous enough. He became ultimately famous enough. So I proposed maybe organizing some seminars or writing some things on a sort of larger worldview than most of the writing and most of the activities of the Institute had taken up until that point. Really, at that point, the Institute had been focused on and was known for its unpopular and counterintuitive at the time prediction that the Soviet Union was on the imminent threat of collapse, which indeed turned out to be the case and gave it a lot of credibility. But I said, what about women's human rights? What about the AIDS epidemic as a heterosexual epidemic in the third world? And Cheryl and James were open-minded enough to let me run with those things, and my involvement deepened and broadened, and ultimately I became an acting director in 1975 or 1976. That was, so 21 years I've been associated with the World Policy Institute. I think certainly where the Institute and the Journal have made their mark the most is in incubating a whole series of remarkable writers and opinion leaders in international affairs. To start with Eric Alterman, who was probably one of the first to come out, and he's written a whole slew of books up to and including Kabuki Democracy. I remember the kind of heady days when in one corner of the floor Tina Rosenberg of the New York Times was working on her book that won the Pulitzer Prize, The Haunted Land. Ian Bremmer, who went on to found Eurasia Group, was working on his Eurasia project, and a lot of people were in their 20s, and it was all very exciting. Ahmed Rashid, who published his article on jihad in World Policy Journal that became his very big book. The book on the End of Alliances, Raja Menon, also began as an article in World Policy Journal. Silvana Paternostro's work on Colombia and Mexico, her article Narco Democracy, for example. My own emergence as a writer was nurtured at World Policy Institute, and the credit for a lot of these journeys goes to three individuals. Cheryl Schwenninger, who was very good at identifying and nurturing young talent. James Chase, who was just such an outstanding editor and example, and also very good at helping articles to really reach their full potential. And Linda Wrigley, who was managing editor, was and also sort of our copy editor, was meticulous at catching things in the text and really working with people's texts, and it was a great team. Karl Mayr also really perpetuated that when he assumed the editorship of the journal. I think the most important thing to come out of the journal and the Institute's work is that it's very important to think outside the boundaries of the Washington Consensus and the Washington-Boston corridor, and that the global reality is far more complex and far less black and white than U.S. partisan politics often gives it to be. And their World Policy Journal and World Policy Institute have played a very important role in kind of widening and adjusting the frame of reference of American policy leaders and the American public. Probably when World Policy Journal published a series of articles and the Institute fostered a series of people's thinking about the weaknesses of a Soviet Union that had been elevated to a position of this overwhelming and permanent threat to the United States, and then the Soviet Union fell apart and the Berlin Wall came down and perestroika happened. I think that was the moment when the World Policy Institute and Journal kind of emerged onto the stage of the influentials in American foreign policy making in a way that was very different from the space occupied by any other journal or think tank. And since that time, it's been able to maintain a kind of original place where ideas that you don't find elsewhere can be given expression, and that's a very important role. I think the most important issue for the World Policy Institute moving forward is to conserve its unique position and its unique voice in the U.S. foreign policy debate, and to continue to put together unusual sectors, unusual geographic regions, unusual ideas, and make the kind of connections that other institutions don't make. For example, the connection between water and energy, or agriculture and global warming, or citizen revolts and the coming together of corporations and governments and capital on the one side, and how this is all related in this kind of immensely complicated Gordian knot, where it's difficult to know how to tease out the threads that can lead you to useful conclusions. It's very tempting to sort of just take the heavy sword of the American viewpoint and hack through that knot, and that doesn't lead to conclusions that will be useful in the very complex world we live in.